In January 1942, the incredible cold weather made us almost incapable of fighting. Therefore, the time on guard duty for each individual soldier was reduced. Now the sentries were changed every half hour. There was a thick layer of straw on the sentry positions, but this still did not save from the frostbite one could get. Frostbite was a frequent occurrence. And if I remember correctly, one guy even froze to death at the post. Nevertheless, it was forbidden to leave the guard post under any circumstances. It was a compulsory measure. The Russians fought on their own territory, and therefore knew how to turn even bad weather to their advantage, including our worst enemies, snow and frost. Under the snow they dug a whole system of tunnels, which they used to get to our trenches unnoticed. Once they even managed to sneak 2 of our men out of a trench on the edge of the village at night. The Russians always used bad weather to capture towns. In an effort to avoid such a fate, the sentries on duty at the front line periodically fired flares into the air, which floated on small parachutes and illuminated the surrounding area. Also, to show the Russians that we were on the alert, we fired 1 or 2 machine gun bursts from time to time. In this way we simultaneously scared away the numerous hungry wolves that were coming up to our trenches at nightfall. These animals sometimes approached the positions even in packs. The howling of the wolves made us sad and foreboding. But even it was better than the howling of Stalin's organ. So we nicknamed the secret weapon of the Russians, which they themselves called Katyusha. The shells fired by these weapons rather resembled rockets. Incredible rumble of explosions, flames, all this terribly frightened our soldiers. When we were shelled by Katyushas, our equipment burned and people died. However, fortunately, the Russians had few such installations and shells for them. Therefore, the damage caused by these weapons was not too tangible. Its use had more of a psychological effect. Speaking of the psychological effect on us, one cannot but mention the Soviet propaganda. From time to time we heard the sounds of popular German songs amplified by loudspeakers, which awakened in us a longing for the comfort of home. This was followed by propaganda appeals in German. They played on the fact that we were exhausted, hungry, and some of us had time to despair. The Russians urged us to surrender to the victorious Red Army. Then you will come home right after the end of the war. We have plenty of food. As a rule, these appeals caused us only bitterness. But there were also those few who were cowardly and went over to the side of the Russians in the dark night. I do not know their fate, but judging by what was happening in Germany after our defeat, I think it is unlikely that any of the defectors received the promised benefits. In addition to appeals over loudspeakers, Soviet propaganda also bombarded us in the form of leaflets. We used them for a more appropriate purpose, although they were not of the softest paper. So we were not too upset when the Soviet airplanes constantly circling above us dropped leaflets on us, but periodically they also dropped bombs on us. It was the worst winter of my life. But the worst was when we infantry were attacked by Soviet T-34 tanks. These machines were well armed and advanced without difficulty both in the snow and in the slough. Their armor, as I have already mentioned, was very hard to penetrate. When the Russian tanks took us by surprise, and we were in the trenches, we would squeeze into our trenches and let them drive over us. Immediately afterward we would have a close fight with the Russian infantrymen accompanying the tanks. During this fight we also tried to destroy the tanks as well by throwing grenades at them from behind. As a result, even if we were winning, we suffered huge losses. We dug graves for our comrades in winter at the end of the village or by the roadside with hand grenades. As I said before, the ground was so caked with frost that it could not be taken up by shovels. We would clear the snow and, wielding crowbars, make depressions into which we would place the grenades. Then we poured some water into these depressions, which, quickly freezing, held the grenades securely where we placed them. Now all that was left to do was to pull the pin and run for cover. The explosion threw huge lumps of frozen earth into the sky. This was repeated several times until we had a hole of sufficient size. After that we expanded it a little with an ice axe and put the body of our comrade in it. Over the grave we always tried to place a cross made of 2 sticks. This was all we could do for our dead, most of whom remained in nameless mounds in a foreign land.